You're passionate about rest and risk. Those seem like two juxtaposed ideas.
I think they're intimately linked. I would actually argue that the gospel is mostly about take a risk. It's not a book of contemplative spirituality, though I'm a fan of that. But it's not, its primary message isn't go off in a corner and contemplate God. Its message is, if you're going to go out and do something dangerous, something that puts your life on the line, pours your life out, you're going to need a discipline of filling yourself in the presence of God. We need a rhythm where we step aside from our work, step aside from the productivity, and really find ourselves again and center our lives in God again, for the sake of that. Out of that restfulness, we live this life of risk-taking.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.
Welcome back to Missions Pulse, where we encourage you to know God's heart and join His mission. Let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like you're out of sync with the timing of God? Or maybe better stated, that He's out of sync or not linked up to your calendar? It's amazing how often we outpace God because His pace is slower than we imagine. And we're going to be tackling that idea and talking about it. I'm really excited to have my guest on today talking about these very things. Before we get into that, though, I would encourage you to like and subscribe to this podcast. I think you're going to be encouraged and inspired. Let me introduce you to my guest today, someone whose words and writings have meant a lot to me throughout the years, and I think you're going to recognize him as well. Mark Buchanan, he's a pastor, author, and associate professor of Pastoral Theology at Ambrose University. His books include The Rest of God, Spiritual Rhythm, Your God is Too Safe, Your Church is Too Safe, and many more. Plus, his recently released God Walk, Moving at the Speed of Your Soul. He regularly contributes to Leadership Journal and Christianity Today. And Mark, man, I'm really excited to have you on the show. Welcome to Missions Pulse.
David, finally, it's so great to do this with you.
Yeah, I am. I've been looking forward to this. I think I've been looking forward to this for the last, we've been chatting back and forth for a couple of years now.
A long time. Yeah, we've sort of been influenced by each other's writings, and I'm certainly a deep admirer of the work you do, and I've been inspired and encouraged and frankly convicted by it. So thank you for doing what you do and being who you are.
Well, thank you for your kind words. I was not expecting to hear that you've been inspired by my writings, but you did say some nice things. You made up some words, I think, in one of your endorsements about the space between memories. You said it's a book about wildfaring and wayfaring. I know wayfaring is a word. Is wildfaring a word?
No, yeah, I mean, I'm stretching language a little bit, which is, of course, at a certain point, you give yourself permission to do these things. And it just so, I mean, you don't even have to get a definition of wildfaring.
Sure. You hear it immediately, you know what it means, right?
Conveys its meaning. I made up a word for one of the books, The Holy Wild, and nobody needs translation. It just simply comes, at least in English, it comes across very clearly, even if it doesn't have a dictionary definition.
Yeah, and that's what I love about your writings. Man, I can almost taste and feel and smell the sights and sounds you're describing. And that's the kind of thing that I would love to bring my readers into as well. That's one of the great goals, isn't it? And inviting them so deeply into the journey and story that they could be there with you on that path.
Entirely. I do writing workshops, and one of the things an exercise, I'll do one of these tomorrow in a friend's grade 12 English class, where I make a distinction between descriptive writing and evocative writing. And evocative writing, that tasting, feeling, touching, where you have the sense of being right in the midst of whatever is being talked about.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know you have a love for words. You've been an author. I think you described yourself from age 5. We'll get into that. But I've really I really appreciated your work. And let me just ask you this right off the bat. You've said before, you said, quoting you, I think it was from The Rest of God, you said, my besetting sin, well, one of them anyhow, is haste. I've had hurry sickness my whole life. I have to say, this admission coming from a man who often writes about Sabbath, rest, the pace of God, it feels a little out of place. What gives here?
Yeah, I'd say my two big themes are rest or slowing down and risk. And
Mm,
both of them are coming out of, they're both acts of self-therapy to some extent. So like perhaps many authors, I'm exploring those things that I struggle with. And I'm basically John Stott says evangelism is one beggar telling another beggar where he found the bread. And in a lot of ways, that's true of any message that we have. We bear it because not because we're experts, but because we discovered something or are on the path of something that is profoundly helpful. So I have always actually and still do struggle with hurry sickness, and I have to be very, very intentional about slowing myself down and
mm,
even choosing. I've recently chosen slow routes to drive to and from work so that it slows me down. I don't go on the main highways.
mm.
These are just disciplines that I'm continually engaging because it's good for my soul. It's good actually for my body.
Yeah.
It brings down my blood pressure and my heart rate and all those sorts of things. So really, I mean, there's no mystery that I'm, confessing. I'm in a hurry, but I write a book not being in a hurry because that's the message I need. So I'm assuming there's a few other people out there that could probably use a little help with that as well.
Probably a few. I was just 3 or 4 days ago, I was pulling into a Big C supermarket here in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And I was looking at the entrance and I decided, no, I'm not gonna park there. And I parked as far away as I could because I think you were writing about this. And I leaned over to my wife. I said, Mark Buchanan would be proud of me right now. And so, I mean, yeah, I think in this hurry culture, this is something that all of us are trying to explore. What does it mean to be in pace with Jesus, and what is his pace?
Entirely, yeah. He had few options other than walking, but I really, as you know, in the book God Walk, make the argument that he was itinerant, so he didn't sort of set up shop in one place. He actually wandered around with people, and I
Mm,
think a deliberateness about that in terms of unfolding this life of the kingdom that
yeah,
is has a pace to it.
yeah. Well, I like what you just said a second ago about how you read a lot about, or you're passionate about rest and risk. Those
Right.
seem like two juxtaposed ideas, but I think there's a lot of books out there that ask us or call us into a place of rest, and that becomes lethargy or
Yeah.
status quo, and that's not, I think, the point that you're getting at whatsoever.
Never. No, I mean, if you look at my titles, they basically break down into books about how to slow down, and then books about how to, leap at the moon, leap off the cliff. So the risk thing, I think they're intimately linked. I would actually argue that the gospel is mostly about take a risk. It's not a
Mm,
book of contemplative spirituality, though I'm a fan of that. But it's not. Its primary message isn't go off in a corner and contemplate God. Its message is if you're going to go out and do something dangerous, something that puts your life on the line, pours your life out, you're going to need a discipline of filling yourself in the presence of God, of finding the courage of Christ for these things, of finding the presence of Christ for these things. And so these things are so intimately linked. And if I have sort of a general concern about some of the emphasis on even some of the Sabbath books that have emerged in the last few years, is they seem to be endorsing a lifestyle of this um, continual stillness or something, uh, which is not the portrait that we get from the scripture. The portrait is, no, we need a rhythm where we step aside from our work, step aside from the productivity, and really find ourselves again and center our lives in God again, for the sake of that. Out of that restfulness, we live this life of risk taking. We live this life of, um, in some ways, that we're so secure in our identity with the Lord that we're willing actually to lay down our lives for the sake of the kingdom and for the gospel. And I honestly, but if I preached or wrote solely about the risk, uh, I would be advocating for a kind of burnout and a kind of
Mm.
almost kind of legalism, where we're just moralistically doing things, great things for God, but we've lost the source of energy for it. So I can't think of, if I get invited to speak to a group of missionaries or pastors or whatever, and they give me two shots, I'll do one. I'll do always the first one on resting, and the second one on risking.
Mm. Yeah, I like how you say resting so that we're re-energized for the mission. I mean, you're speaking my language here. I mean, I've been in some crazy places. I've been apprehended by a United Wa State Army carrying AK-27s and M22s, but um, these kinds of things without rest. The second word you just mentioned, burnout. Yeah, I think I can relate to that. And so you own a motorcycle. I mean, you're writing about rest. You seem like you have a flair for, I don't know, wildness, wildfaring. Catch me up on your story a little bit. And how did you marry these two things, risk and
Yeah.
rest?
Well, I've always been, I in one of my books, not the ones we're talking about today, but I talk about, um, the Hobbit story, where Bilbo Baggins, he's a Baggins, which means all he wants to do is sit around and drink his meat and eat another, a second brekkie. Whereas he's also a Took, and the Took is wildfaring blood. The Took is,
Mm.
restlessness. Let's go find an adventure. Let's go raid a dragon's lair. And I feel that both of those sort of identities deeply exist in me. So part of me is super lazy. Part of me likes nothing better than a whole day kind of moseying about the house, padding about my slippers, with nothing pressing. But 2 days of that, and I get soured up. I get really bored. And so I will just about do anything, get on my motorcycle. I'll go out on a solo hike in the Rockies, which is not to, Rocky Mountains, which I live right beside. That's bear country. Like, it's not to be recommended that you go out there by yourself, but there's something in me that, loves the risk, loves the danger. And then, to be honest, in ministry, so all of this is sounding very sort of, first worldy. Um, my wife and I launched a ministry a couple of years with Indigenous women, and it's women coming up out of, often, an addiction that was impossible to break given some of their circumstances. And so we developed a ministry where women come and live in a community for a better part of a year, and we take them through a whole program of personal healing, of vocational training, of, physical, the restoration of their physical health through both exercise, good food, and we connect them with doctors and dentists, etc. And it's kind of been the messiest, most glorious thing we've ever done in our lives. And I'm over 60. I'm not far from retirement age. But honestly, the idea that I was going to, in a few years, retire and simply do the sitting by the fireside thing, that is anathema to me. I
Mm.
actually looking for a Caleb life, where at 85 I'm still looking for hill country and giants to
Yeah,
fight. And
yeah.
but I don't think I can get there if I don't have also a discipline of just soaking in the presence of God.
Yeah, amen. It's funny you mentioned that story. 2 days ago at our staff meeting here in Thailand, my brother-in-law, who just joined us here in Thailand within Reach Global staff, mentioned that very story, grabbing hold. I want that mountain. 45 years later, I think he's
Yeah,
still longing for that mountain. Give me the mountain, Lord. And
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because I've been in that part of Israel, and it's like, no, to this day, nobody's up there. Nobody's wanting to develop. It's not farming land. And this guy's a soul scrapper, and he says because he knows he's basically the reason we got stuck here out in the desert for 40 something years is we got scared of the giants and let me at him. So
yeah.
I've actually had a prayer for years now, David. Around the Caleb thing, and I think hill country and giants is give me the tough assignment. Don't sort of notice that I'm 85 or that's his age at that point. Give me the tough assignment. Give me the unfinished business.
Yeah.
And I want to be in a place now at 62, but I hope when I'm 82 or 85, I'm still asking the Lord, give me hill country, give me giants to fight. So I like to me, this is actually at the heart of the message of the kingdom of God. What I have done in my writing, as you know, is saying the attempt to do this apart from a deep intimacy with Christ is going to fail tragically. So please attend to the deep intimacy, but don't make it all about, I'm just going to sit here with Jesus all day. The Mary Martha story is very important to me because we often hold up Mary as a hero. I think Martha is a hero of that story. I think Mary, well, all of us get frustrated with Mary. If you're a missionary or pastor, you're like, come on, get on with it, right?
I've been there.
Yeah, this idealization of sitting at the feet of Jesus. Yes, awesome. All day? No, thank you. I think Martha is being summoned back by Jesus, and the cue or the clue to that is he says her name twice. And there's 7 times in Scripture where God or Jesus says the name twice. Every single one of them is a calling story or a calling back story. And it's usually a call into something dangerous. So Moses, Samuel, Saul, the Paul story. Peter, when he's going to fail Jesus, and Jesus says, I need you to get your act together, and I need you to come back and strengthen the brother. They're all danger stories, calling to the mission. And so when Jesus is Martha, Martha, I think he's saying, I need you to come back into the mission of God. Because your work of hospitality is at the heart of my kingdom, but it's not going to work if you're bitter. Like if you're just clanging, throwing the dishes at the floor. This is not going to be a winsome demonstration of the welcome of my kingdom.
Yeah.
But I need you to be an awesome host, which you are, but not today. So I think that I just frame that story. I think we're meant to read it differently, partly because Luke 10, where it occurs, is all about mission. It's all about Luke 10 beginning is go sending the 72 out to do the dangerous mission. Luke, the middle story is the Good Samaritan, go find people in ditches and help them. The next story is Martha and Mary. So it's going to be a mission story. We're expected that. That's how Luke writes. He writes in triads, the lost Luke 15. It's a mission story. And if we don't read it as a mission story and a missionary, i.e. Martha, who lost the plot and needs to be summoned back to it. So anyhow, I'm getting all, preaching now, and I'm sorry, but there is a sense where if we forget that the heart of the gospel and the heart of the kingdom is the proclamation, the taking forth, the embodying of the good news of Jesus Christ, we have lost something utterly vital, critical, central to the story of God among us. However, and again, I think that I've come in a kind of a reparative way over the years, saying, I watched this in my own life as a pastor. I've watched it in the life of missionaries, where there is no off switch, and that produces bitterness, like Martha forgetting that hospitality is actually key to the gospel. She's forgotten that.
You're flipping the paradigm on end here. I love, though, how you're taking that story, because I've always struggled with that. And I'll be honest, Mark, I did not think this conversation was going like that. I was gearing up to talk about God walk, talk about slowing down, and we will. But now you spent most of the time talking about risk and
Yeah,
adventure and the mission of God and this grand narrative that he's been penning from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation. And I have to say, I really appreciate that because as someone who's spent the last 25 years of my life overseas, deeply passionate about people who have no gospel access, they are not going to come to faith in these spiritual dead zones without some sort of risk or hacking through the jungle in a trailblazer kind of style. And so when I read about Mary and Martha, I want the better thing. I do.
yeah,
But I don't necessarily resonate all the time with Mary.
yeah.
I do resonate more with Martha. So it's I
Yeah,
appreciate you.
here's a another sort of extending of that story. Jesus says very explicitly, the Greek is Mary has chosen the agathos, a good thing, or the better thing. It often gets translated. It leaves hanging the question, well, what's best? If that's just better, what's best?
Okay. Yeah.
And I think the story actually, and a lot of the ways the stories of Jesus are set up, is they implicitly ask us a question that then we have to go work out. So they sometimes explicitly ask the question, like at the end of the prodigal son story, do I not have a right to rejoice? That's an explicit question. But many of them are implicit, and we have to go think about them. And the implicit question at the end of the Mary Martha story is, if Mary's chosen what's better, what's best? And I think one of the ways we can answer that, if I could have Martha's productivity, hospitality, this deep impulse to welcome people in the name of Jesus,
Hmm.
and I could somehow that productivity is coming out of Mary's intimacy, that I knew Jesus.
Yeah.
I had a deep onto deep relationship with Jesus. That I think would be best. And so that's really, if I could almost sum up what I've been trying to do in 20 years of writing, it's I'm trying to create a culture where Mary and Martha come together, and there's the
Hmm.
deep intimacy that then flows out into this high levels of productivity.
Well, I think we could just close this whole conversation down since we know your life purpose now. No, I'm
That's
just
right.
joking. Um, uh, well, I'm going to ask you some next questions then, but I like how we kind of started the portrait with the idea of risk. So we'll look at through that lens
Sure.
almost.
Yeah,
And I
it's
think
great.
I'll hear your
Which
answers. Yeah,
yeah,
because I
sort
think not a lot of people are so busy, but they're not necessarily busy about the large K kingdom stuff. They're busy about their small K kingdoms of their own life. But for those who want to join the mission of God in the end, and that's the point, and make Him famous wherever their geographical location is. How has the harried pace of this hurry culture affected not only the pastor or the Christian leader or missionary, but also the common Christ follower who perhaps find themselves so bullied and busy by this culture of
yeah.
hurriedness?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're living in a moment, a cultural moment, David, where we're busy just being busy. So it used to be
Yeah.
we're busy doing like we're building barns, we're planting fields, we're bringing in harvests or whatever, right? We're fixing parts, and now we're busy with being busy. So if you ask most people, do you have any, do you have spare time? They're like, no, I'm slammed. It's
Yeah.
not. Maybe in 3 weeks I can go for coffee or whatever. And if you say, well, what are you doing? You usually stump them. And they're like, well, blah, blah, blah. And it's a lot of commuting and it's a lot of attending meetings that don't produce anything and da 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 da. So we're the culture that are busy just simply being busy. And that's part of what's so enervating. I mean, there's a glorious kind of weariness if I've been building a barn all day and at the end I
Sure.
fall into bed and I just I can hardly move a muscle, but I'm kind of, there's kind of a joy in it, right? Whereas if I'm busy all day and I have nothing to show for it, I fall into bed and I'm restless and I'm turning, I'm anxious and all that sort of stuff. So that's part of the moment. I think the greatest threat, though, to all people, like you say, just the Christ followers, not leading an organization or going to the ends of the earth. I think that the great peril of any Christ follower is to get into scarcity thinking. And we get into scarcity thinking with resources. We can get into scarcity thinking with just the power of God to be present in a situation, and we can get into scarcity thinking with time. And I think the harriedness that you talk about is creating in a lot of people a scarcity thinking about time. This this sort of non-renewable resource. Money we can always somehow find more of, time not. And with that kind of scarcity thinking, it leads to all kinds of actually a whole book was written by some Harvard professors, and I can't remember their names, about 10 years ago, and I think it's called Scarcity or something. And the subtitle is when thinking you don't what basically the tragedy of thinking you don't have enough. And they do this huge study, global study of the effects of scarcity thinking and the kind of anxiety it's producing, the kind of desperate actions people often resort to when they're in scarcity thinking. So that's, I think, the thing. And actually, it's been with us since the garden. I mean, that's the devil, the serpent in the garden doesn't lie. Ever thought about that? He doesn't say,
No.
if
Yeah.
you eat this, you'll be like gods. Well, they are, and et cetera. So he's not trafficking in lying. He's actually playing on something that must be a precondition in Adam and Eve, and that is the sense that there's not enough.
Hmm.
So he actually kind of evokes and he plays on and he stirs up this sense of scarcity. And then that's actually what they start to experience on the other side of the fall is scarcity. They can't make enough, they can't get enough. They're working all the day long and there's nothing comes of it. And so I think that's the real battle. And I think why Jesus is all about abundance and I'm not talking prosperity gospel. I'm just talking there's more than enough. There's a there's a lavishing in the heart of God toward His people, toward His children. And if we don't get attacked, I came to give you life and life to the full. There's even in sin, there's this abounding of grace. So it's an abundant culture that God's creating. That renewing of the mind toward that, I think that's some of the deepest work of discipleship, moving toward abundant thinking. And so the culture is this culture is a serpent in this case, trying to convince us there's not enough.
Yeah. And I think these words are certainly, I mean, they resonate with me. I keep thinking, I don't know why, as you're talking, I'm thinking of myself, and I have a lot of guests on the show. And they don't necessarily, they talk from their perspective, but they don't talk in the perspective or paradigm that I understand being an overseas missionary. But what you're describing is so cross-cultural, cross-geographical. It includes nearly everyone. I mean, I'm thinking of Thai friends I know. I'm thinking of Chinese friends I know. I'm thinking of everyone can resonate with what you're saying.
Wow.
And we're just simply outpacing Jesus. And we're busy on the go and blowing by him and barely even recognize him because he's so much slower than our pace, or our pace is so much faster than it ought to be, I guess I should say. In fact, you talk about this, I think I'm saying it right, Kosuke Koyama, in his book, The 3 Mile an Hour God, describes God as slow and says that God, in his slowness, does things in our depths, whether we notice them or not. And then you follow up on this thought by saying, in a culture where busyness is a fetish and stillness is laziness, rest is sloth. But without rest, we miss the rest of God. The rest he invites us to enter more fully so that we might know him more deeply. So what are we in danger of missing? What is this lack, this scarcity that what beyond that are we in danger of missing when we outpace or distance ourselves from the pace of God?
I love the way you put it, this sort of outpacing. We're running ahead of God. And Kasaka Kuyuma, in his beautiful book, 3 Mile an Hour God, by the way, he was one of the first missionaries to do really contextual theology. So his book, Water Buffalo Theology, he's a Japanese theologian who did missions in Vietnam and began to
I
realize that
see.
Western models of mission were completely uh, they connected, they translated, they didn't translate into Vietnamese
Poorly,
culture.
in the very least, right?
Yeah. So water buffalo theology is what
Okay.
does it mean if you're in the the river deltas or whatever of Vietnam, and it's this agrarian culture, etc. So anyhow, that's a little shout out for Kayama. Uh, the thing about Kayama is he's writing for missionaries. So if your listeners who are in mission, it's really worth getting a hold of, especially 3 Mile an Hour God. It was intentionally written for missionaries who have a high level of urgent sense of the call of God, and he doesn't want to squelch that. He wants to
Mhm.
say, however, don't outrun God.
Yeah.
And his point is that God actually is slow, and he doesn't mean, that there's some intellectual developmental issues, but that God is not in a hurry. And if you think about the biblical witness, this is absolutely true. Like he takes his time to unfold a thing. Even I mean, even the coming of the Messiah and then the second coming of the Messiah, he's taking a long time to get there. And the getting there it can't be a delay of logistics. It can't be because God is deficient in resource. It has to be part of the strategy. So what we have to, at least again, there's this implicit question: why? I think that we have to talk about the culture a moment again. We have fetishized efficiency in our culture.
Mhm.
What the scriptures are concerned about is effectiveness. They don't care about efficiency.
Mhm.
And these things are often pull against each other. They're opposites. Create an efficient system often means we have an ineffective system. It's why highly efficient organizations always become dysfunctional. Always. Why, you can think of some of the great, or the huge multi-corporate entities that exist on the earth right now, and the worker experience, we sort of realize it's another form of fiefdom, right? Or like,
Yeah.
and because the
Are you
efficiency,
talking about Twitter right now? Because I feel
yeah.
like you're talking about
Oh my goodness, right?
Twitter.
Like there's that sort of the sociopath. Sorry, but the sociopath sort of takes over the organization and brings all the sociopathy into the organization. Um, like, where's that going to go? That has nowhere to go except finally kind of the death to the soul stuff. So it's this efficiency thing that is such a fetish is actually over against effectiveness, which has to do with the deepness of the soul, the growing of the human, the flourishing of the human, the flourishing of a community. These take time. They always take time. So again, the work that my wife and I are doing, we looked at, and all of these women come out of, they've been in multiple treatment. They've all gone to treatment. They've all gone to their 4 weeks or 6 weeks. They've all got clean, and a week later they've fallen back because it's efficient and ineffective.
Yeah.
What we've done is we've slowed it down, and it's one-on-one, and it's long walks in the woods, and it's holding the women when they can hardly, when they can hardly stand up. They're so sad and so traumatized. And that not I don't hold them. My wife holds them, or other women, and we tell them how beautiful they are and how loved they are. It's a slow work. But my goodness, effectiveness.
And,
We watch it. We watch the
and
life transform. So I think that's really. I honestly think that if we're going to be in any of the kingdom work, we have to get with the pace of God, which is slow because God wants to produce fruit, not vegetables. Vegetables you can grow on a season. Fruit takes many
yeah.
years.
When you talk about this, one of my closest missionary companions is a Chinese man. I call him Zhang Rong. Is his pseudonym. For security's sake, I never mention his real name. And I remember one time he's at the pace of Jesus. And I think it's come through a number of circumstances where he's experienced deep persecution. One time I lost him. I was traveling with him and he went off in this direction, I went off in another. we're while hiking through this mountain village in southwest China, and I couldn't find him. 3-4 days go by, and I'm calling. I just have no idea. I think he's been apprehended by the police for preaching the gospel in these unreached areas. 4 days later, he calls me with dejected voice and says, "David, I'm alive. I'm here." He travels 24 hours to my house, sits on my couch, and I see cigarette butt burns all over his face.
Oh,
he was tortured in a Chinese jail for 3 days. And I said, "Do you want to take some time off from ministry? Do you want to just go home and lie low?" And he prayed this most beautiful prayer, saying, "No, I want to thank you, Jesus, for letting me suffer for your sake." And when he opened his eyes after that prayer, I was in tears, and he said, "David," I get emotional just thinking about this right now. He said, "David, make sure you always sow the seed, because the harvest is in the seed, and the seed knows what to do." It was such a simple phrase, but that slow seed buried deep, breaking forth, bringing new life takes time, and he knew it. And I, as the Westerner, perhaps wanted better for him, but he knew better. It seemed to me. Sow the seed. The harvest is in the seed, and the seed knows what to do. That slow pace.
Wow, you walk among the giants, eh?
That's the true story of Within Reach Global. I'm just some homeschool kid from Prescott, Arizona. The true heroes are the nameless, faceless ones.
Unbelievable. Yeah, but truly revealed in heaven, eh?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but I've heard you mention this before, that the fourth command of the Ten Commandments, Sabbath, is the linchpin of all the other commands in the Decalogue. Why is it then that so many Christians think that this is optional?
I honestly, David, I've thought so much about this, because I really think, just first of all, the fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment, gets into the Ten Commandments. It's creational. So it's woven into the creation and the creation story, the six and the one, the God who rests, the God who invites us to rest. And then it becomes covenantal. It becomes part of the 10 things that are foundational to a rich relationship and community and with God. And this is the only one we think optional. So if you think about that, have you ever heard a Christian? I've known lots of Christians who have committed adultery. I've never heard one boast about it. I've known actually a few Christians who have committed murder, but they're anguished about it and repentant about it and seeking the restoration of God about it. I know thousands of Christians who brag about not taking days off. And there's this weird disconnect that somehow we think not only is the Sabbath optional, but it's almost a sign of weakness that we would sort of need and long for and embrace the Sabbath. I think why? I think actually, if there's one area that the evil one is really trying to seduce us away into this scarcity thinking, it's around the gift and the need for Sabbath and the command of Sabbath. Because when I say it's a linchpin, I really mean it. It actually comes between the first three commandments, all having to do with God. So our vertical relationship and how we know God, relate to God, trust in God. Then the fourth commandment, Sabbath, and then the sixth commandment all have to do with people. How do we relate to people? How do we kind of live well within communities? And I think if the evil one can sabotage our Sabbath keeping, he can actually mess with all of those other relationships. I think it actually breeds a sense of the inadequacy of God to be there for us and provide for us. So the scarcity thinking, and I think that it also complicates and trivializes and superficializes, if that's a word. It makes shallow all of our human relationships. And so I think that it's a linchpin, because it's really this place between this hinge piece, or linchpin as I call it, between the relationship with God, the relationship with others, And I would argue the relationship with ourself, that at the heart of Sabbath is a homecoming, is a coming back into our true identity. And it takes longer to sort of unpack that, but I think it's built into the very Sabbath that we find ourselves again. So you get rid of Sabbath, you've actually you've deeply, deeply damaged every other relationship, starting with God, going to your parents, and all the way through to employers and spouses and children, etc.
Yeah. Wow. And I have been guilty of saying online or in person, I'll rest when I die. And that kind of bragginess about how busy I am or
Yeah.
how busy about the Father's work I would hope to be. And I hear you, that linking together, the fulcrum of between God and between man, the linkage there.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe let's change a little pace here because well, I first received your book, The Rest of God, from Ron Luce. He was the founder of Teen Mania Ministries and Acquire the Fire youth conventions. If you remember those, it was
Yeah, I do.
millions of people who came to Acquire the Fire. And I was at Teen Mania in 1996 and became close to Ron. And he, after Teen Mania closed, read your book. And he messaged me and said, "This is the best book, you need to read it." So he sent it to me. That's the first time I ever received The Rest of God. And it was a perfect time for me. It was a season where I was probably feeling burnt out and weary, and questioning why in the world I've made this choice to become a missionary. What have I done? So can you give us maybe some practical tips? Because I think when you're talking about Sabbath, it's not often welcomed, right? People kind of maybe roll their eyes a little bit when you talk about it. They'd rather hear you focus on risk a little bit more.
Yeah.
How can we slow to God's pace? Do you have some practical tips, or what does a Sabbath day of rest look like for you?
Well, I would start with why I wrote and think my book, God Walk, is a sequel to The Rest of God, is I think the premier practice, I think actually I make the argument that God Walk, that one of the premier physical disciplines of a Christ follower is to walk if they have capacity and ability. And I deal with those who, for whatever reason, can't walk in that book. But walking is the speed of God. That's Kosaka Kayama's argument. It's the speed of God, the walking God, the God who walks in the cool of the day. Christ came and walked among us. Yeah, he says, "Follow me," and he means at the pace I'm walking. So I think the premier activity of Christians is walking, and I would say, especially on Sabbath. I've been twice in Israel during Jewish Sabbath, and though many things are forbidden, driving your car, commerce, etc., one of the things you see is everybody's afoot. Everybody's out for a stroll, and there's this deep community that forms around walking. I would love to see that recovered in the church. Actually, that if we're within walking distance to our church and the weather isn't inclement, we actually walk to that place. We walk together, that pilgrimage together. I make it a habit that on my Sabbath, I walk virtually every day and try to get about 3 to 5 miles of walking in a day. But but Sabbath especially is a day where I really try to make it a communal walk. I walk with others. I would just say it just walking by its nature, it's an activity. So it's not stillness, but it's a slowing.
Yes.
And I would the other thing is one of the practices of Jewish community around Sabbath is thinking of the Sabbath as they call it the Sabbath bride or the Sabbath queen. So this guest of honor coming into your home. Now that image has never worked for me. It just makes me anxious. A queen or a bride is coming into my house. I just get all flustered. But the idea of a friend that I don't get to see often, but when I do, I'm elated just at the thought of getting to be with them, and I delight and savor every moment with them. And then I say goodbye with sadness, but can't wait till we get again. I've got a few friends like that. When I think of the Sabbath as a friend coming to that I get to spend time with, and I put aside ordinary routine to be with that friend. So when I'm thinking of one friend in particular, like we just put aside, we rearranged our schedules to be present to one another. That's what Sabbath is. If I would just say, if there's one thing that I would try to sort of lock into the minds and hearts of your listeners, if they're trying to sort of get Sabbath, is think of that person that you would rearrange your schedule just to be with them. If you could sort of anticipate Sabbath like that and practice Sabbath like that, you'll get it. You'll get it right.
Well, I think that's getting at what you often describe the Sabbath as, and what Jesus said. The Sabbath, or man is not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath is made for man. And it
Yeah.
is something that is, if we could welcome into our life, it changes everything. And on that idea, there's lots of books out there. You have the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry and all these, lots of other books. And a lot of people are making cases out there to just, take your phone, throw it away, quarantine from any sort of technology, and that's going to be called Sabbath. Is that what you're getting at? I mean, I heard you just say the other day that, what did you say? Digital devices make brilliant servants, but horrible gods. Doesn't seem like you're saying then take our phones, stick them in a drawer, and that's Sabbath, and just stop.
Yeah,
right?
I actually have a big issue, and I'm not critiquing. I haven't even read the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, but I hear it's very good. I not critiquing any other writer who thought about Sabbath. My caution is that technology, according to Marshall McLuhan, is whatever extends human power. So clothing is technology. Certainly, zippers or buttons are technology. And so when we say about and people have mostly recently clarified it, digital technology. But here's the thing: what if your Sabbath is the day connecting with friends, where you are, back home in your hometown, or what if it's for grandparents connecting with grandkids? It's going to often take digital technology to do that. To sort of put a total ban on digital technology because somehow it's a great enemy is just, I think we're moving toward a legalism that in the end is going to be like the 400 and whatever rules that the Pharisees had, that then we're just fussing around maintaining the rules. What we're looking for is what is actually going to renew, replenish, restore, bring us back to our relationship with God, our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with others. If technology, in whatever form, can be a servant of that, awesome. If it's enslaving in any way, if it's a tyrant, so you're always checking your phone to see, who's texting you or whatever. I think that's where you want some disciplines to sort of restrain it, or go put it in a box. So I really want to nuance it. I very, very when I wrote The Rest of God, I interviewed many people, and many who had grown up in a Sabbatarian culture where they really wanted nothing more to do with Sabbath because it becomes so oppressive and constricting. And I thought, how do I steer my way through this? Because I grew up pagan, like I didn't have any of that. But I wanted to honor the voices of those who says, please don't try to restore Sabbath. It was so dreadful. And I remember a person telling me that their parents would take them to the beach, but they weren't allowed to swim, so they could wade out into their just below their waist. But anything beyond a wave might take them down, and they weren't allowed to swim, so they would drown. And it's just so idiotic. And I thought, honor the people who had a traumatizing experience of this Sabbatarian legalism, but also say, my goodness, but don't you want to sort of savor this gift that God Himself was saying, you can stop now. So so anything that smacks of that kind of legalism, I kind of immediately I start to get nervous about.
I like how you use the word savor, and I think that's something that, again, I described your books as I could almost taste and feel what you're describing, and savoring the goodness of God in Sabbath, in slowing, in rest, in the pace of Jesus. When we talk about this, and we're busy, and we're charging hell with a squirt gun, or so busy about ministry that we want to take risks, it can be irritating sometimes to hear about that. But
Yeah.
the savoring, taste and see, know that I am good. I think that's what you're
That's the heart of it.
ultimately helping people understand.
Yeah. Years ago, when the book Rest of God first came out, a man who was the editor of the Seventh-day Adventist magazine, which is deeply Sabbatarian, and some beautiful stuff about it. But he flew all the way out from somewhere in the East to come and interview me about the book. And so we sat down in my office, and he set up his recording stuff, and he basically kept trying to convert me to Sabbatarianism. And finally, I stopped and I said, "Tell me you didn't fly all the way out from New York or wherever it was to try to convert me to your perspective on this." And he got very quiet. He turned off the audio stuff, and he said, "I'm sorry." He says, "I've just been steeped in this so long, I can't help but try to advocate for it." But he said, "But I'm sorry." So I said, "Can I ask you honestly, why did you come here if it like if why did you come, what did you get from the book that you thought was warranted an interview and a report in your magazine?" And he said, "Well, in my tradition," he says, "I think we do Sabbath well, but," he says, "none of us actually love it."
Hmm.
And he said, "You do. And I want to know how to fall in love with the Sabbath again and the God of
Wow.
the Sabbath." And so I said, "Well, turn your audio back on. Let's have a talk about that." So it was a really, I thought that was a beautiful interview after that, where I wasn't trying to push up against his Sabbatarianism. I wasn't trying to convert him, nor if he, and he stopped trying to convert me. We just talked about what it was to actually savor the Sabbath,
Nice.
act of savoring the God of the Sabbath, and that became really redemptive.
That, that's exciting. That's really so amazing, and it kind of leads into my last and final question here. Your words, your writing have really truly impacted my life. I don't know how much I know I've said that, and I don't mean to keep saying it over and over, but the rest of God is highlighted through and through in my Kindle edition, because I've needed it. I'm that kind of guy who does not know how to savor rest without a little bit of aid from those who have gone before me. And so your books, your words, this message of savoring the rest of God, of enjoying the pace of Jesus, has kind of resonated around the world, missionaries, pastors, etc. What is it that you hope to set in motion in your lifetime?
Yeah, that's very easy to answer. I really want
Okay.
people to fall in love with God, with the Lord, with Jesus. Anything that I can do that would f- freshly astonish people with the goodness of God, that they would be, they would fall at their feet and say, "Oh my, Rabbi, Rabbi, it's you." That's what I'm about. And
Mhm.
out of that love of God, they would do the kingdom work. That would be the taproot of all that we're doing in terms of evangelism, mission work, etc. This deep love of knowing the love of Christ, returning the love of Christ in the imperfect human way we could do it, but just that He actually wants us to love Him, even though it's a flawed love that we give. That's my life mission right there. And
Wow.
everything I write really is toward that end.
And as you say that, it does remind me even of the byword of this entire podcast: know God's heart, join his mission. When we do eventually or unwittingly fall in love with Jesus, or hopefully more intentionally, fall in love with him and come to experience him even closer and dearer, the things on his heart then rub off onto our own. We want to walk alongside him. Slow it may be, but it's still his mission, and he's the
Yeah.
master.
Amen.
Well, hey, Mark, I just really appreciate you taking the time and joining me on this conversation. It's been meaningful to me, and I hope to many others.
Me too. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join his mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.